this year, Madam Speaker, and I commend it to the House.
Mr. Paddy Ashdown.
What is everybody leave?
Madam Speaker, it might be for the benefit. Madam Speaker, may I first of all, before dealing with the normal and usual courtesies, which I'd be delighted to do in a moment, to those who proposed and seconded the speech, say to the Prime Minister how much I welcome his change of mind on the paedophiles register. This is very welcome. This must be, I would have thought, the fastest U-turn in history, that there's now been a U-turn even before the Queen's Speech debate has started. What a government. Can I just say to the Prime Minister that if he or any member of his front bench team had bothered to approach the right honourable gentleman, the leader of the Labour Party, or myself, before this debate, he could have had exactly what he's had to give way to now at any moment. But of course, he didn't want to. He wanted to play politics with this in the way that has happened in his speech. And I think that was a pretty good example of why and how this government has failed in all sorts of ways, which I shall touch on later. Let me now join the Prime Minister and the Right Honourable Gentleman, the leader of the Labour Party, in paying tribute to those who have died from this House in the last year, and in paying tribute to the mover of the loyal address, the Right Honourable Gentleman Sutton Coldfield, arguably, probably, definitely the last chairman of the Conservative Party who's looked back on in the party with any kind of affection, I would have thought. And I'm bound to say that his speech showed us perhaps why. The Honourable Gentleman from the Isle of Wight, who gave a good speech, mentioned, I think, 3 of his predecessors who's been Prime Ministers. They were, of course, all Liberals. Indeed, I think he succeeded in mentioning 5 notable people from the Isle of Wight, all of whom were Liberals, and 4 of whom he spoke of in glowing terms. He will therefore understand why it is the dedication of my party, both nationally and locally, to work assiduously and to leave no stone unturned to ensure that he has a long and happy retirement, and that the next representative of the Isle of Wight is a Liberal Democrat as well. Now,
thanks again there for Barry Field, and before him Sir Norman Fowler.
The Prime Minister, Madam Speaker, told us that the Queen's speech was and I use his words exactly, a common-sense, practical programme of traditional Conservative values. Well, the year since has hardly provided a ringing endorsement for that claim. 2 members of his party have left and joined the Liberal Democrats, arguing specifically that that party, his party, had lost touch with the traditional values of decency and fairness in the British people. And in May, of course, the British people themselves delivered their verdict on that Queen's speech, on this government, and on that claim. They voted Conservative councillors out in their thousands and left the Prime Minister leading a tiny rump in local government and controlling just a handful of councils. Probably the Conservative Party has never controlled fewer at the local level. A very fair indication, I think, of the mood of the nation. And now, in this Queen's speech, in the programme for the next year, what we see is a programme which reveals a government in its tormented and twilight days. It is, frankly, a rag bag of irrelevant measures. There are 1 or 2 measures in there which, of course, can find wide support. The paedophiles register that the Prime Minister has now changed his mind on, we're delighted about that. The legislation that he's going to bring in to control marine pollution, National Crime Squad legislation that's been brought back, we'll find it possible to support that. But this is a programme driven more, quite evidently, indeed by their own admission, driven more by what will wrong-foot the opposition parties than about what is right for the country. Not my words, his own admissions, their own briefings over the last 24 hours. What an extraordinary admission. We now have a government that's actually acting itself more like an opposition than a government. It's changed its psychology entirely. What the British people now are crying out for is a message of hope, a strategy for Britain's long-term future. What they've got here is a tactical plan for a short-term Tory survival. I have to tell the Prime Minister, it won't work. It won't work for 2 very simple reasons. First, because people will not forget the government's failures, its bungles, its incompetences, and its broken promises. And second, Because do what it will, this government cannot paper over its divisions, it cannot hide the sleaze, it cannot escape from its own record. The Prime Minister said that to say this was to criticize everything in Britain. What nonsense. He said that, in fact, there was more good in our society than bad. But we weren't criticizing our society. We were criticizing his government. And in the record of his government, there is far, far more bad than there is good. It's not this party who criticizes society. It's that has so frequently done this in the past. You know, since 1979, the government has passed 757 laws. 757 laws. Yet for all that, they have completely failed to solve Britain's deep-rooted and endemic problems. Despite £130 billion from North Sea oil, despite £80 billion from privatisation, the British national debt over that period since 1979, the British national debt going for 300 years, has trebled under Conservatives, and it's doubled since the Prime Minister took office in his present job. Indeed, that £170 billion John Major debt alone, accumulated in 6 years, doubling the national debt since 1990. That debt now amounts to £7,500 of extra debt for every family in Britain. And that debt is still increasing under his premiership by £1,000 a second. We are now, Madam Speaker, spending more paying the interest on the John Major debt than we spend annually on our police, on our prisons, and on our universities all put together, just to pay the interest on the Prime Minister's debt. But you know, the money from this extra borrowing, this hasn't gone into preparing Britain for the future or improving the lot of ordinary people in this country. You know, despite that extraordinary level of borrowing, our National Health Service is facing a financial crisis. I use the word, and I use it advisedly. It's been used by many who know the situation very well in the NHS. It is facing a financial crisis this winter. Beds are closing. Waiting lists are lengthening again. Education has been cut and cut and cut over recent years, and undoubtedly is certain to be cut again in order to make room for tax cuts in this year. There is now 1.25 million children in classes of over 31, and that figure has gone up 10% in the last year alone. 1 in 7 21-year-olds in Britain now have trouble with basic reading and writing, and 1 in 5 have difficulty with basic mathematics. Britain has now slipped to a position in the World Education League table below China and Argentina, and just above Venezuela. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of people remain trapped on welfare and out of work. Crime has doubled since 1979, and 1,000 homes a week are still being repossessed. But you know, the failures, Madam Speaker, of this government are not just revealed in the figures. The poll tax, the privatisation of rail, the arms to Iraq, the cash for questions, the Purgai Dam, what all this and much more adds up to is a record of incompetence and underhandedness, which I think is probably unparalleled from any government in modern times. And this year we've had perhaps the most glaring example of all, the handling, or should I say bungling, of the BSE crisis. You know, even if we suspend judgment on the mistakes made in containing the BSE epidemic since the mid-1980s, the last 7 months have been an object lesson in dither and delay, in scapegoatism, and in blank incompetence.
Well, this debate is going to continue in one form or another in the Commons now until Wednesday afternoon.